This country was built on a distinctly American work ethic. But today, work is in trouble. We've outsourced most of our manufacturing to other countries. And with that, we sent away good jobs and diminished our capability to make things. American Giant is a clothing company that's pushing back against this tide. They make a variety of high-quality clothing and activewear, like sweatshirts, jeans, dresses, jackets, and so much more. All made right here in the USA, from growing the cotton to adding the final touches. So when you buy American Giant, you create jobs for seamsters, cutters, and factory workers in towns and cities across the United States. And it's about more than an income. Jobs bring pride, purpose. They stitch people together. If all that sounds good to you, visit American-Giant.com and get 20% off your first order when you use code STAPLE20 at checkout. That's 20% off your first order at American-Giant.com with promo code STAPLE20.
Hey, everybody, welcome back to the Instigator podcast. Coming to you on the eve of Ryan Miller's jersey retirement. We're going to talk a little bit about that, I think, this evening as we record this, but we got a few other things we want to run through as well, of course. So, kind of a long laundry list of things that we could potentially talk about, actually. So, we're going to try to get through as much as we can here. First things first, Tyler. The news around hockey, at least last night, and we're recording this on Wednesday, the news around the league right now is regarding Ivan Provorov and his decision to sit out warmups for the Flyers Pride Night game, which was played last night. So for those of you who don't know, part of the NHL's initiative to reach out and be more inclusive to communities around the world, specifically in the United States, is hosting Pride Nights, and that has come to include wearing uniforms with rainbow numbers, using Pride tape, and other in-game and game day initiatives. It's typically a one-day thing, and every team does it in some way, shape, or form. I don't know all of the ins and outs of the Flyers Pride Night promotion for this season. But I do know part of it was the warm-up jersey and the Pride tape, and that was all part of the package. And Provorov did not warm up, and the team, John Tortorella specifically, came right out and said why. Said it was due to his religious beliefs, and that was kind of the long and the short of it. And now, we're sitting here now, post that decision, and now there's, of course, blowback coming back on both the Flyers, Provorov, and I think probably John Tortorella as well. And it's just a really difficult situation, Tyler. It's really something that's been hard for me to really wrap my mind around, because there are a lot of competing interests here. This is not quite as black and white as an obscene gesture or an off-color comment. There's some shades of gray here, which I think make this a really, really difficult conversation for probably the league to have internally too, because if they do, at the bare minimum, and this is the more logistic argument, not talking about the people involved, but at the bare minimum, if the league continues to let players do this and to say, for religious purposes or religious reasons, they choose not to participate in one thing or the other, you could have a raft of players causing headaches by not participating. But on the other hand, if they are asking players to simply blindly comply and they're not being heard at all, they have that same issue just in the other direction. So really very much a no-win situation in a lot of ways here for the NHL as a whole. And then, of course, in the more micro sense, there is the simple fact that Ivan Provorov couldn't bring himself to wear a jersey for 15 minutes, without making any personal commentary or anything like that. He couldn't bear to wear the jersey for 15 minutes to show some support for other human beings. So it's a very complicated situation here, and it's one that I'm interested to see what comes of it, because I have to imagine the league is going to have to find some solution to I don't want to say protect themselves, but to address and handle these situations in the future, because really there's no precedent for it previously.
Yeah, this is complicated. Obviously, Chris, I think you and I are both of the belief that Pride Nights are great. They raise money for very worthy causes. It's important to note that the Pride Night jerseys, they go for auction. Every team does this, and the proceeds just go to, in this case, the Flyers Foundation. The Sabres do it; it goes to the Sabres Foundation, and they distribute the money as they see fit. And it's not like the certain theme nights, whether it be Native American Heritage Night or Pride Night or anything like that. It's not like all of that money is earmarked for causes representing those certain endeavors, if you will. You hit on it, Chris. The thing that really complicates this is Provorov saying it's because of his religious rights. Obviously, it would have been much easier for him to, even if he didn't agree with it, he obviously doesn't agree with Pride Night and what that represents, to just sort of grin and bear it for 15 minutes, wear a jersey, and then move on with his life. He has obviously opted not to. The first thing I thought last night when seeing the tweets from Charlie O'Connor, the Athletics Flyers beat writer, was if they could have, they would have scratched him, the Flyers. I wholeheartedly believe that. I think, again, citing the religious beliefs, scratching a player, benching a player, whatever that may be, when a player invokes his religious freedom, then you are not only, opening yourself up to a grievance from the PA, but it's literally illegal. You can't do that. It'd be the same thing as sending somebody home from their desk job because they didn't care to do something that, in their opinion, violated their religious beliefs. And Chris, my first thought was to look at this and say, okay, well, every team in the league has done Pride Nights through various, whether they do the Pride tape, like you said, the rainbow tape, or the jerseys or other initiatives, for a while. And obviously,
Yeah.
Ivan Provorov has been in the league for a while, and this is the first time that this particular player has publicly said, "I'm not doing it, and this is why." So obviously, I looked and said, okay, well, did they have Pride jerseys last year or the year before? Did he previously wear one? Because you can't just do something for 5, 6, however many years, and then the next year say, I don't want to do this anymore, religious beliefs, because there's a precedent that you've set. This was the first year that the Flyers did jerseys for their Pride Night. Previously, they opted for the rainbow tape, and per Charlie O'Connor, who was on the Athletic Hockey Show today, Provorov had never participated in that, went with the standard white or black tape and carried on. And obviously, not opting to use Pride tape is a little bit more subtle than refusing to wear an entire jersey, right? So it'd be a little less noticeable. But there is now a precedent of him, choosing to not partake in these Pride Nights, and as is his right. Where I have a problem, Chris, is really with the Flyers, right? Because there's people in that organization that have been there longer than John Tortorella, who's been there 4 months, that will have known this. You know what I mean? And the Flyers team, obviously, notwithstanding Ivan Provorov, but mainly like Scott Lawton and James Van Riemsdyk, who are very involved and are kind of at the forefront of their efforts, in being inclusive, if I could get my words out properly, really pushed to do a bit more of a public stand here for Pride Night, and that's what led to the jerseys. In my opinion, there was obviously nobody that really tipped off Tortorella or anybody to say, hey, if we do this, he's probably not going to go along with it, and we should have a plan for if and when that takes place. Because Tortorella was, as you said, he came out and said, hey, this is why he didn't do it. This is why he didn't take the warmups. And no, I didn't think of benching him. And I kind of hit on why he didn't think of benching him. I don't think he could think of benching him. I think he would have, but he couldn't. So I think, whether it's the PR people, whomever is involved, with doing these sorts of events, somebody really should have tipped off the coach so that he was a little bit more prepared. If you think about it, obviously we don't know when Provorov made the decision to not wear it. He could have walked into the dressing room, and said, I'm not wearing that. And Tortorella and everybody's got 45 minutes to figure out how they're going to react to it. And it's a bit of a fire drill. Or he could have said, hey, this is going on the calendar, just so you know, I'm not wearing it. And that could have been in October. And they could have had 4 months to prepare for it and still didn't. We don't know. At the end of the day, somebody in the Flyers organization dropped the ball, and it led to it being handled post-game the way it did. From a hockey point of view, Chris, Provorov is a guy who's on the trade block. I don't think many teams are going to be lining up to get a guy like this currently. It's pretty well known that he's not very well liked in the Philadelphia dressing room. There were some post-game press conference comments from Scott Lawton. When he was asked about it, he basically said, I'd prefer to talk about the guys who get it. So pretty direct shot at Ivan Provorov, and
yeah,
it'll be very, very interesting to see how they go about this. But the big thing is it takes away, Provorov's actions take away from, the point of having a Pride Night, right? It's to shine a light on a community that is underserved, it's underrepresented, and it's gone through some tough times, and it's really unfortunate that this is what we're talking about instead of what the goal of a Pride Night is, and especially in Philadelphia, where I think pregame it was Lawton and JVR had several dozen like non-binary youths in and did the locker room tours and gave them a really nice day, and now we're not even talking about that. We're talking about a guy's decision as to whether or not he was going to wear a practice jersey, which is really unfortunate.
Yeah, and that's one of the things that also stands out to me from the perspective of hockey is slow to change, and it's just in general a conservative sport, both capital C and lowercase c. I mean, it is just it's very much set in its ways. So it is still rare to find players, especially at this high level, because these guys are, if you rewind 20 years and you look at, what youth hockey was like 20 years ago. And when I say youth hockey, I mean from, the lowest levels up through, before junior or college. It wasn't an area of the world or of sports in general that was going to be ever really talking about inclusivity and things of this nature. This is still a relatively new, it's something that's new that's been adopted by the sport of hockey as a whole and the NHL. So, and they've made some impressive strides in many cases. So it is impressive to me that a player, that Scott Lawton has embraced this the way he has. And that is what makes it makes it unfortunate. And it is interesting that Lawton's, comments were as pointed as they were, because he, this isn't just, the team, picking a player to be their you can play representative, and they mail it in. This is our representative. We'll shoot our promo and we'll call it a day. And that's the long and the short of it. Because people may remember, it was probably 3-4 years ago now, maybe longer. Max Domi was selected as Arizona's, and it was like right on the heels of him making, I think it was homophobic and racist remarks, but someone will have to fact check me on that 100%. But he had found himself in hot water for something that, the You Can Play project would otherwise oppose. So, just to juxtapose where we were and where we are. But it is fascinating to me that this situation has arose where you have two players, as you mentioned, JVR was the other one, who are especially involved in their efforts to reach out to the LGBTQ community, as opposed to maybe a team where they're happy to do the event and they embrace it to a point, but beyond that, it's relatively surface level. So it is interesting that this dynamic exists in a locker room now, where you do have one, two, maybe there are more guys who do care a little bit more about it than most typically would, and now you've got a guy in Ivan Provorov, um, you know, leaning on his religious freedoms as the reason for doing it, but now really going on a hard line against what some of his other teammates believe. Generally speaking, a hockey locker room is one that probably doesn't have too much trouble getting over this sort of thing, but you never know. And it's been a weird year in Philly to begin with. John Tortorella has been, his, as he always does, finds himself in the center of a lot of the controversy. But yeah, it kind of stacks up, and so it is interesting. Very interesting dynamics at play there in Philly for a lot of different reasons.
Yeah, this is unique, right? As I said, this is the first time that we know of someone just straight up being like, nope, not for me, not doing it. But it's also important to note that this is not the first time that players have said some not so popular things due to their religious beliefs. I mean, this was kind of pre-Twitter, but Pavel Datsuk, who we all, the Magic Man, who we all remember as an unbelievable hockey player, and that's exactly what he was. But also Russian Orthodox, said some controversial stuff and cited his religious beliefs, and was certainly not what we would call all inclusive. You know what I mean? In Eastern European religion, the Orthodoxes, whether it's Greek, Ukrainian, Russian, the sort of run of the mill normal Russian or Ukrainian or Greek Orthodox person that's actually practicing is much more conservative than a run of the mill practicing Christian, if you will. And I think that's important to point out that and I'm by no means religious, Chris, but I think a lot of people that are, at least for the Christian faith or any of their denominations, probably would have just said, you know what, like I don't believe, not a fan of having to do this, but I'll suck
They
it up.
wouldn't care. Yeah.
And Chris, you and I have been in more than enough locker rooms at enough levels to know, that the hockey locker room is on the political scale, they're leaning, a little bit more right than left. Let's put it that way.
Mm-hmm.
And this is a locker room too. Let's not forget that Tony DeAngelo is in this dressing room here. So it's not like you have a dressing room of 22 choir boys and Ivan Provorov. Obviously, JVR and Scott Lawton were at the forefront of this, and that's what Charlie O'Connor said. I'm not just reading between the lines here. And they obviously didn't have. It wasn't unanimous because Provorov is in the dressing room, but they obviously got overwhelming support to do this, enough to take it to management, to the coaching staff, and say, this is how we want to do it this year for Pride Night. Tony DeAngelo, we don't need to rehash his past 18 to 24 months and the hot water he's found himself on. I think it's probably fair to say that whether it's through his agent or through the league or through the team or the Flyers itself, that he's pretty much on double secret probation. So I'm sure he was ready to hop up and say, oh yeah, I'll wear that uniform. I'll wear whatever you want me to wear. But the fact that you've got guys from all over the world with a lot of different backgrounds that were able to do this, except for one guy, I think speaks to the unease that's in that dressing room right now. And yes, as you said, Tortorella finds himself in the middle of it. He covered himself in glory with the comments, as I said. To be honest with you, Philadelphia's, they had won. I don't know if they won or lost last night after their pride game. But going into it, they had won like 7 of 8 or 8 of 9. They were NHL 500. This is a team that's supposed to be tanking, and they're a hell of a lot closer to the last wild card spot than they are to lottery picks. The top of the lottery, and now you've got this team that is having to deal with this. They've talked about off the ice kind of considering everything in terms of how they're going to free up cap space, retool their roster, and really Ivan Provorov was their most movable defensive piece, right? That had a little bit of term and was able, you'd be able to get some money off the books. But now, like I said, who is touching this guy who, not to say it lightly, but appears to be a locker room cancer in Philadelphia and has 2 more years left at almost $7 million of cap hit. That's something that, this organization and that roster, that dressing room is going to have to work through, not only to say, okay, you know what, we got to get through the next 3 or 4 months here and then we can handle it, but probably the next 24 or 36 months at this rate.
Yeah, they did win last night. Their current standing, they're actually tied with the Sabres in terms of total points.
Exactly.
They are 1 point ahead of Detroit. The interesting aspect of the Eastern Conference right now is that, the Sabres and Philly both have 45 points, 5 points behind Pittsburgh and the Islanders. So Pittsburgh currently holds the final wild card spot, but they are tied with the Islanders. Both have 50 points. So both, Sabres and Philly 5 points behind those two clubs. They're also 4 points from second last in the conference. So it's an interesting dynamic between, ninth and 14th, basically, in terms of how tight it is from a points perspective, that these teams haven't fully separated themselves yet. So there's some weird machinations at play here where, Philly wins last night. So they jumped from 43 to 45 points. And now, you could argue that they're, kind of in the playoff hunt, if you wish, but they could go lose 3 more games and then, they'd fall back down to, 8th or 9th in the conference. So it's an interesting dynamic. And, the Sabres are right in there. That's one of the things we're going to talk about here too, is just, the ebbs and flows of the Sabre season. But, knock on wood, luckily the Sabres haven't had to deal with any locker room turmoil this year, which has been, which is a nice relief, and not that they've ever had to face anything quite like this in recent years. Hey, we're going to take a quick break here to hear from our sponsor, DraftKings Sportsbook. Of course, NFL playoff action continuing this weekend. The Bills creeping ever closer to a potential Super Bowl berth, hosting the Bengals on Sunday. And, of course, for the NFL divisional round, DraftKings Sportsbook has lots of great deals running. They are, of course, an official sports betting partner of the NFL. Right now, new customers can bet just $5 and get $200 in free bets instantly. And, of course, new and existing customers can take a shot at even bigger payouts using DraftKings stepped-up same-game parlays. You can take advantage of boosts that they offer. They offer these things all the time, whether it's for the NFL, NHL, you name it. You can take advantage of the boost that they apply to these parlays and get up to a 100% profit boost on the bets that you're playing. I've taken advantage of this numerous times. I've been able to cash in on some of those, and I'll tell you what, the payouts for those are big. It's a really nice feeling to win those parlays, because the payouts can climb pretty high. So what you need to do is download the DraftKings Sportsbook app and use code Instigator when you sign up. New customers can bet $5 on the NFL division round and get $200 in free bets instantly. That is only at DraftKings Sportsbook when you use code Instigator. Minimum age and eligibility restrictions do apply. Please do see show notes for details. The Sabres did make some news this week as we move forward. They hired John Roth. He was named COO of both PSE and the Buffalo Sabres. And it was clarified for anyone who may have missed this, or even the clarification was, I think, pointed to people who maybe wondered, oh, does this mean he is going to be involved on the hockey side or elsewhere? Very much a Ted Black hiring. He, really sounds like he's going to head up the business and operational side of the organization, and he'll do that for PSE as well. What I found interesting, and is that this is very much a position which, as far as I can gather, based on like the reporting around it, it sounds like it's a position that is going to fill a lot of the duties that Kim Pegula handled as president. And given the lack of updates and that the Sabres and the Pegula family have I'm sorry, the PSE and the Pegula family have given on her health status, I can't help but wonder if this is simply one step of many of filling her role and allowing her to continue her recovery in private and probably moving her further out of the public light for the foreseeable future. And let me clarify that, that's, I'm not saying that we need to know any more than they are willing to share. The Pagulas have been very, Terry Pagula has been quite clear about their intentions to keep this private and to keep it within the family. I think there have been a lot of people wondering from the public perspective, what comes next, if Kim Pegula, whether or not she's coming back or not, wondering, okay, if she remains the team president, who's doing the job day to day. And so at the very least, they can now say, okay, John Roth is the COO of the Buffalo Sabres. You shouldn't need to ask anymore about who is going to do Kim's work, for lack of a better term, from the Sabres or the PSE perspective. It seems like Ron Rakuya has been doing most of that from the Bills side of things for quite a while now. So I mean, at the very least, I would hope that maybe this quiets. I don't know if anyone was left asking these questions at this point, but maybe that tamps down any more people wondering, okay, who's in charge of what over there right now? Because obviously Kevin Adams has had his finger on the pulse from the hockey side, and for anyone wondering, okay, like who is handling the business interests here? They now have that answer in John Roth.
Yeah, absolutely. And you said it perfectly there. You spelled everything out about as best as you can. He's basically going to be the Ron Rakuya on the Sabre side. And, as you said, prior to this hire, in Kim Pegula's absence, it was on the Sabre side, it was a little bit of Rakuya, kind of bouncing over to the Sabre side. It was a little bit of Kevin Adams taking a little bit of the president duties and Jason Carmano's, splitting GM duties a little bit, I think, sharing that little bit of Kevin Adams' plate. And Terry Pegula was a little bit more involved, at least within the last 3 to 4 months. So as you said, this will kind of put everybody back in their own lane. Rakuya will go back to just running the Bills side of things, which he was doing. I think it should be important, which he was doing before Kim had her medical issues. I've said it before on the podcast, but even when Kim was fully healthy, it was usually Ron Rakuya doing the press conferences in terms of the Bill Stadium and everything like that. And then on the Sabre side, Adams can have his normal workload. And I think the Ted Black comparison is probably a really good one. I think he'll be tasked with the business end of things, trying to get some revenues back up to where they were, if not pre-pandemic levels, but higher. We've talked about this. We've hit on this briefly, Chris, but they still don't have some helmet sponsors, which is obviously some lost revenue, and with the TV ratings
sponsor either.
Yeah, and with the TV ratings taking a hit over the last handful of years, obviously they're not getting as much TV revenue from ads and sponsorships in that vein either. So I think that's where he'll be focused. He won't be touching the hockey side at all, just as Ron Rakuya doesn't butt into Brandon Beane's office and say, why aren't we trading or signing this guy? I'm sure he'll know about it, just as co-workers do, but it certainly won't be John Roth's decision to go add a defenseman or waive a player or anything like that, for sure.
Yeah, absolutely. So yeah, that's a couple of the most noteworthy news items going on these days. Moving on, talk about a few different other topics here. Tyler, it's officially official. The Sabres are sticking with this 3-headed goalie monster. They used some roster gymnastics in the last week to, send Jack Quinn up and down, send Peyton Krebs up and down, and they rotated Ukko-Pekka Luukkonen through paper transactions between Buffalo and Rochester. They obviously knew that that wasn't going to be a long-term solution. They could only go so long with sitting really one of their three, because they only did have the three players of Krebs, Peterka, and Quinn. Their three roster waiver exempt players in and out of the lineup, especially because, and quite frankly, all three of them playing fairly notable roles in their own right. It's pretty hard to keep those guys out of the lineup. So that wasn't going to be a long-term solution. They had to find a better option to keep Luukkonen with the big club, because Don Granato came about as close as you can to saying he's his number one goalie. And they looked to have solved that issue by waiving Vinny Hinostroza on Tuesday afternoon. Now, we wait to see what happens with Hinostroza. It's possible that a team could claim him, and if that's the case, of course, he'll move along to that club, and that'll be that. And the Sabres will be short one more forward, but they'll have the roster spot to bump Luukkonen up full time and not have to worry about moving anyone else around. Now, if Hinostroza is not claimed, it does not mean he is going to go to the AHL immediately. Now, I would imagine that's part of their plan, because Kevin Adams made note of, wanting to get him back, back playing. It's not fair to him to have to sit and be a scratch all the time. But if the Sabres wanted to, they could paper Vinny Hinostroza. Clearing waivers doesn't mean you have to go down. It simply gives you a 30-day waiver window. So the Sabres could continue doing the same thing that they're doing with Luukkonen and Krebs and Peterka, but add Hinostroza in, and they could rotate him through just as they are with the other two. Now, will they choose to do that? I think that's a little bit harder to say. He has only played a handful of games. He hasn't been overly spectacular in them. I think part of that is probably, of course, not playing very much. But at this point, he was something of an insurance policy. The players that they took that policy out against were primarily Krebs and Peterka, and they've shown that they deserve to be here, and they deserve to stay with the big club. So, Hinostroza's overall usefulness and utility to this team is kind of run its course. So parting ways with him isn't the worst thing in the world at this point. It's nice to see them make this decision, because I think in the past the Sabres wouldn't have been in a hurry to let a veteran go like this. But they're starting to make some of those harder decisions. Not that this is a super hard decision to make, but you're still admitting, allowing a team to take a player for free should he be claimed. And, I don't think that's an easy decision for any GM to make in the NHL, given how risk adverse those guys are. So, we'll see what comes of Hinostroza being waived, whether or not it's he's donning a New Jersey come Thursday evening or not. But, the Sabres are creating some flexibility for themselves. I can't say I'm overly heartbroken that Hinostroza is leaving. He did some good things for them. He certainly helped, some in development track for Dylan Cousins at times, but we talked about this at length when they were considering re-signing him in the summer, when they finally did, even going back to last year. I think, these are the types of guys that really, quite frankly, kind of grow on trees. Look no further than Tyson Yost. He was a waiver claim himself. He's fit in beautifully. He's doing a lot of really good things for the Sabres, and he was a free asset, right? So, you can lose Hinostroza, and you're not going to have to look too far to find a guy who can fill that role admirably, if not better at times. So, happy trails to him should he move along. But, we'll see what the Sabres decide to do, whether it's Rochester, if they loan him to another AHL team that maybe is closer to his family. I'm not sure, but it would seem that Hinostroza's time in Buffalo may be coming to an end here.
Yeah. And Kevin Adams did try to do right by the player. It was on 32 Thoughts, both the podcast and the written version, that they were making calls, trying to find him a new home, trying to find him a guaranteed place to play in the NHL. And obviously with him going on waivers today this afternoon, there weren't any takers. So I would suspect that he goes unclaimed, and then the Sabres, as you said, can fully manipulate that 30-day window, a la the Maple Leafs did with Wayne Simmons a few years ago, or I mean, it may have even been last year. But yeah, this is something that I think the writing was on the wall. As you said, Don Granato comes out and said basically, when all three goalies are healthy, the edge is to UPL right now. And with that being the case, you're not going to waive Comrie or Anderson for the reasons that we've discussed, pretty solidly over the last week or two here. So you've got to make room for them, and you're also not going to carry 6 defensemen. And more power to Cal Clegg for locking down a spot on the roster, and it appears taking that 7th defenseman job with both hands and not letting go. So you look at it. I think it was between Vinny Hinostroza and Rasmus Asplund, and I think Asplund is probably a guy that gets claimed relatively quickly, given his salary is about half that of Hinostroza. He's a restricted free agent, so there's he's not a pure rental. If Asplund were to be claimed, and although Asplund is having a down year, obviously by the fact that he can't get in the lineup, I think teams would look at his past years and his past year's defensive metrics mainly, and say, hey, here's some bottom 6 depth for a playoff run or what have you. In terms of Hinostroza, as you said, Chris, this was a guy that you and I we understood the logic behind bringing him back. He was the guy that we didn't really see the need, to be frank, given that the writing was on the wall with how this roster was going to shake out. As you said, he was a pretty good fail-safe, and in the case of JJ Peterka and or Jack Quinn, not getting off to a fast start or not earning a job out of camp, and obviously those two younger players have taken their roster spots and ran with them. So there was no spot for Hinostroza. It's unfortunate, but it happens. It'll be interesting to see what they do if he were to be claimed, Chris, because I think he's a guy that they obviously didn't want to lose. I mean, I think that's why they waited as long to make this decision as they did. And I think it's important too to note that Hinostroza, well, not a top 6 forward by any means. I mean, I think his skill set, though, given this roster and his straight line speed, he's much more suited to be filling in for a Quinn or Peterka if they need a night off on that second line, as opposed to Rasmus Asplund, because I just don't think the pace of play that Asplund brings is up to the speed, literally and figuratively, of Quinn, Peterka, and Cousins. So I guess, obviously Asplund is your 13th forward, and outside of that, does Anders Bjork become your first call up, or has he been passed down in Rochester by Brandon Byro, Brett Murray, guys like that? So
I mean, I can tell you personally, I would rather see Byro and Murray than
so would I.
Bjork,
So would I.
Yeah.
I would rather see just about 20 other forwards from Rochester before Anders
the other
Bjork.
thing that I think you have to ask yourself, and this of course applies to the Sabres management, is at what point should a call-up be needed? Do you opt to take a look at Yuri Kulich or Isaac Rosén? They're not completely lighting the world on fire down there. They've certainly had a good start to their pro careers. And I think Kulich probably has a little bit more of that pro profile than Rosén does, in terms of, who has the most, the quote unquote man strength, right? And of course his World Junior was really impressive. But I think that's probably another thing that would factor into their decision making of, like, okay, we only need someone for the weekend. We've got, just use this week as the example, actually. Like last minute, we need a call up here for the Islanders and the Ducks games. And we know that, Kyle Okposo needs, a couple nights off and he's going to be fine for Monday. Do they say, like, you know what? Yeah, call Kulich up. We'll get a look at him for a couple nights, reward him, and we'll send him back down. Because I do think you're probably getting into that territory. I don't know if they're there quite yet. I think you'd probably need to see a little bit more from Kulich and Roseanne over a slightly longer period of time. And what I should clarify that by saying, that we're in this post-World Junior period. As they get ramped back up to the pro speed coming off the World Juniors, maybe as you get into February, March is when they would have that consideration. But I do think they're probably entering the conversation, and it's worth noting as well. But I'm not too concerned about the decisions they're making at 13th, 14th forward. I think Asplund is worthwhile enough to be plugged in the lineup, and I think they could, in a pinch, if they're missing Jack Quinn for the night, or if they need a replacement for Tyson Yost or Casey Milstead, whoever, Peyton Krebs is skilled enough to move up to one of those two lines, and you can plug Rasmus Asplund in with Okposo and Gergensons, and he'd be just fine. So I don't think there's much to worry about in that respect, but that's just my take on it.
Yeah, I mean, I completely agree with everything you said. I would also agree that, depending on how the Sabres stretch run here goes, probably post trade deadline, obviously. If the Sabres tend to fade down the stretch here, and the Amherst, the Amherst are in kind of a similar situation to the Sabres right now. I mean, they're in a playoff spot, but they have games in hand on a lot of teams around them. So I think the Amherst are a team that, in the case where they lock up a playoff spot with some time to kill in their regular season, and obviously the Sabres season's still going on, I wouldn't be shocked to see Kulich get a game or two, just as kind of okay, let's see what you got, and kind of an attaboy as well. He's got 17 points in 26 AHL games, so he's producing. He's got the build. I think his body is NHL ready. And given what the Sabres roster looks like come trade deadline, or come post trade deadline, there may be a spot that makes sense to give him a look. Same with Brett Murray. I'm thinking of guys that could potentially be on the move here. And Zemgus Girgensons comes to mind. If he wants to go chase a ring, get a taste of playoff hockey, I wonder if he's a guy that the organization, even though he's a UFA, would talk to before entertaining that, or how that would go.
Yeah, that's a good point.
But yeah, he's a guy that I think has earned the right to kind of say, hey, I want to go, or hey, I want to stay, and the organization to kind of abide by that in terms of Girgensons. And I agree with you in terms of Peyton Krebs as well. I thought the two games that Quinn and Peterka were down, I agreed with them needing a weekend off to kind of recharge the batteries. I thought that's exactly what they should have done, and that being, Asplund down in Krebs' spot, and putting Krebs up into that top six for a cup of coffee there, just to kind of reward him for his solid play in a position, in a role that he's not the most familiar with. Obviously, they didn't opt to go that way. They even opted to take Krebs out of the lineup, which was something I strongly disagreed with. Hopefully we don't see that again the rest of the year. And obviously this transaction leads me to believe you won't. But yeah, it'll be interesting to see how they operate now with Hinostroza on waivers, and what happens come 2:00 tomorrow afternoon, and if he's still part of the picture or not.
Yeah, and now they will have 3 goaltenders probably full-time or at least for the foreseeable future, and the unique aspect to this, of course, is the fact that Craig Anderson really can only play once every 7, 8, 9 days, right? So, it's a 3 goaltender rotation, but you're not trying to juggle all 3 of them on a night-to-night basis. It's not an ideal scenario to be in. I think it's kind of unique. We're on the eve of Ryan Miller's jersey retirement, and the Sabres have a 3 goalie rotation. Miller's, real coming out party was in that 05-06 season when they opened the year with Miller, Norton, and Baron trying to figure out who was going to be their starter. So kind of funny in that respect that we find ourselves back in viewing such a similar situation. We've made mention of it. Sounds like Luukkonen is the Sabres' de facto number 1 goalie. What I think is interesting here is that in the short term, the roster juggling that they were pulling off with the paper moves, moving Luukkonen back and forth, still getting him games, has allowed them to keep Comrie off the ice a little bit longer because he is still coming back from that knee injury. He even said after that Seattle game he knows he needs more time to really feel like he's fully up to speed. So I do wonder again if Luukkonen hadn't been sick for that Seattle game, he's probably playing in it. And, maybe we're not seeing Comrie even until like the Ducks game this week. I'm not sure. But the challenge now becomes finding the right times to specifically for Comrie to get him games. Because if Luukkonen's going to be the starter most nights and you're going to get Anderson his start once every week to 10 days, it's finding the right game times for Comrie to get in the net so that he is not ice cold every time he gets in, because the last thing you need is to have well, they already have it, but have all 3 of your goalies by and large underperforming, right? I mean, Anderson's numbers, counting stats are still good. His last 2 starts have not been that great. And now and then the other 2's, their counting stats both certainly subpar. Just looking at Buffalo's, their January, they have played 1 game where they haven't allowed 3. They have 1 win where they have allowed fewer than 4 goals, and they have 2 games total where they've allowed 3 goals or fewer, and both of those games were 3 goals against. So the goal prevention still the primary issue for this team, and that is not just a goaltending issue. It is a systemic issue as well from the terms of the players in front of their goalies and the youth that they have. But this goaltender rotation is going to be something that is not going to be easy for them to juggle. And the other interesting part of this is that I feel like, in a way, we could have just ran last week's episode again this week and called it a day, because I don't think anyone would have. I think the lesson that we spoke about last week with setting the right expectations for this team still applies firmly with them right now. January has not been kind to the Sabres. They've had a couple nice wins. They beat the Capitals in OT. They beat the Wild in OT. They had a pretty nice win there against the Predators last Saturday. But in between that, they had a very, very ugly loss to the Flyers. They had a frustrating loss to the Kraken. They ran into a hot goalie with the Jets. And then they've since lost their last 2. So January has not been kind to this team. It's been somewhat of a difficult slog. They are not out of that playoff conversation, though. They're 5 points out of the second wild card right now. They have 2 games in hand on the Islanders, who they play tomorrow night. They have the same number of games played with Pittsburgh, who do hold that spot for what it's worth. But they have 2 games in hand on the Islanders. They have 3 in hand on the Panthers. They can still make up some ground. They can keep themselves in this fight. It's not over by any stretch. But as we talked about last week, this is a young team. The ebbs and flows of a season that normally happen are going to be at times more extreme for this club because of their youth, the skill set they have, the shortcomings they have. And I think we're seeing that certainly in the micro right now with these last handful of games, because that Flyers game is probably still really fresh in a lot of people's minds. They go ahead and they drop 2 more after that to the Kraken and the Jets. Maybe you feel like they shake the cobwebs loose and beating the Predators on the road. It's a really nice win for them for what it's worth. But then they come back Monday and Tuesday, lose a game to the Panthers where they really didn't threaten much, and then give one away to one of the worst teams in the league in Chicago. So, the last week, Monday to Monday, some really frustrating results, and I think results that people are kind of going to hyper focus on. Whereas still the big picture, they are, again, in my opinion, as I see what this team is doing this year and what they've been able to accomplish, very much on track to checking a lot of the boxes that you should expect them to check, and finding themselves in a position to remain competitive in the Eastern Conference. They may ultimately just be a little bit too far outside the conversation to be a real threat for the playoffs, but they've taken far more strides than they've taken in recent years. And I mean, this is twofold. I certainly don't hope, I certainly don't want them to continue this skid through January and come out the other side of January completely out of the playoff picture. But at the same time, the fact that they've had a rough week has not taken them out of the race, which I think is really, really notable. They are very much still in this thing, and I hope that more people can really grasp that.
Yeah, it's as you said, it's a lot like last week, and where you know almost game to game, week to week, fans' sort of emotions are swinging pretty drastically, right? Um, but as you said, there's some underlying weaknesses, some warts, some misgivings about this team that are, to be quite frank, are not going to resolve themselves between Thursday's game and the end of this year. It's just not going to be the case. This team is still going to have to probably add a top 6 player. They're going to have to add a defenseman, that's going to be the case likely as we sit here and do our end of season talk, right?
Mhm.
Unless, Adam says, damn the torpedoes, and put some chips in the middle for a Jacob Chychrun type before this deadline. I do want to touch on the goaltending real quick. We've already talked about Don Granato's comments. I don't want to say I don't want to say I was surprised by them, but I did raise an eyebrow a little bit because to me, there's maybe half a degree of separation between UPL and Comrie at the moment. Friend of the pod, Chad D over at Expected Buffalo, I was talking to him the other day, and he said, they're still the same. They both, Comrie and UPL, they both let in one bad goal a night. UPL just makes a couple more saves on top of the bad goal.
He certainly has looked like he looks better.
Yeah, and he looks more confident. But at the end of the day, you are what your record is, and
no, I agree. I totally agree. It's very
just
the goaltending is very much perception based right now.
Well,
That's what they're dealing with.
Like it is, and last week it was everyone's talk. We had the discussion of the fun with numbers with UPL, right? In terms of, do you want to look at his first handful of starts? Do you want to look at the fact that he's won or had won, 6 out of 7 or 7 out of 8, whatever it was, 7 in a row? I think it ended up being before he lost. But that Nashville game that they won. They won 5-3, and it was a nice win. It was a nice bounce back after getting goalied by the Jets. 2 of those goals he let in were bad goals. It was funny because the one goal where he pushes out and he gets beat at the high slot was basically a carbon copy of the goal Comrie let in against Seattle, where we said, I wish Comrie was 2 inches taller because he probably would have gotten a toe to it. It was like the same shot. Which just goes to say that, these goaltenders are a lot more similar than they are different. at this point. And moving forward here, before they hit the All-Star break and have the week and a half off, they play, let's see here, 7 games between tomorrow night and the 1st of February. And as you said, how are you going to split those up? I think obviously one of them will go to Craig Anderson.
Mhm.
And frankly, if I was Don Granato, I'd probably want to give Anderson the Anaheim game, because that's probably the easier game, and then you try to get the 2 goalies that you're going to have to ride for the majority of the stretch run here, kind of in a little bit of a groove heading out west. But Craig Anderson hasn't played. You know, he played on Tuesday, which is the 17th. So either the Winnipeg game or the Minnesota game on the road, will be 9 or 11 days since his last start, and Eric Comrie hasn't started in over a week. And I almost feel like you have to give him one of these home games. It's going to be bizarre, and it's funny. We talk about, sort of the memeable saying now, the meaningful games in March. They've got, in my opinion, they've got 2 must-win games here. In the Islanders, the team that they're chasing and have the games in hand, and then obviously they've got a really, really, really bad Anaheim team at home for an afternoon game. That's a must-win, all caps and underlined. But for everybody who is still harboring what they feel are realistic playoff hopes, these are 4 points you have to have. Do I think the playoffs are realistic, Chris? I mean, I think you and I are both of the belief that they're probably not there yet, and will gladly take the 10 to 12 point improvement year over year that they're showing right now. They're on pace for. But we shall see.
Yeah, it's a tough. This is a tough and yet pivotal stretch for this team. The Islanders certainly no slouches. They coming in tomorrow night for the big night, the Ryan Miller night. If Sorokin's starting, and I would assume he will be, he's been one of the best goalies in the NHL this year. The Ducks, as you mentioned, probably easier opponent. I kind of wonder actually if they'd go the opposite direction here and they put UPL or even Comrie in that game, in a sense of like, okay, this is a team we want and or need to beat. Let's put our best foot forward. But after that, they go on a central conference. If I may date myself, swing, playing the Stars, Blues, Jets, Wild. None of those are easy outs. The Blues, the Blues are plucky. They're not a horrible. They're not having a great year, but that's still some quality on that roster. That's not going to be an easy out, certainly on the road. And then they come back and they host the Hurricanes on the 1st before the All-Star break. So it's not, these last handful of games here in January and that first one on February 1st, not easy games. Certainly not much that you're going to look at and feel confident that the Sabres are easily going to go, 5-2 or whatever. It's a tough stretch of games, and this is the game they're playing, man. If they're going to be serious contenders, they do have to start winning some of these games. That's the long and the short of it.
I mean, I think. So go ahead, Chris. I'm sorry.
No, that's all I was going to say.
Yeah, I mean, I think this is this next 2 weeks here leading up to the All-Star break are going to determine, how obviously the organization, but we as fans sort of approach, not to use that phrase again, but the stretch run. I already talked about the 2 home games. You discussed their trip through the Central Division all on the road. They're playing the top 3 teams in the Central and the St. Louis Blues. All of them over the last 10 have been playing at least a 600 points percentage clip. You know what I mean? So
yeah.
they're not going to have any easy nights. They're on the road starting the 23rd, and they play 4 games in 6 nights by my count, all on the road, going from Dallas to Minnesota. I mean, that's that's a tough haul, when to come home from Carolina. To Carolina, obviously, we know the Hurricanes and what they bring to the table. So no slouches here, and I don't really know. I've already said that they need 4 points out of the 2 home games before they head out west or out central, I guess, if you want to be technical.
Yeah.
But those four road games there. I mean, I'm thinking if you include the 2 quote unquote must wins, 4-2-1, I think is probably what you need to do to realistically give yourself a shot. If you take 5 out of 8 points on the road trip and win the 2 home games, I think that gets you in a good spot heading home for Carolina. But it's a lot easier for us to say that sitting here on a podcast than it is for them to go out and execute it against teams that are playing really, really well. And I would, apart from the teams, you're probably going to see Jake Ottinger, Connor Hellebuck again, which, super, two brick walls, which again, points to the importance of the goaltending position. Which goaltender is going to be able to outduel, two Vezina caliber goaltenders, and then, what St. Louis and Minnesota throw at you. It'll be very interesting to see.
Absolutely. Yeah, no question. Yeah, it's an important stretch. If nothing else, it's important for them to get back on level footing here. It's the first half of this month has been, again, pretty rough on them. That Blackhawks loss has to leave them feeling pretty sore, and not just because they gave up the lead, but it's just not a good team over there, and that's something that they just should have been able to clean that up easily. And probably something we should talk about on a future show is the way that the Sabres struggle, not only just offensively, but shutting games down. So that's a topic for another time, of course. But Thursday, tomorrow night, as we record this, maybe listen to this on Thursday or after. Again, big night from the fan perspective, but it's a big night for them on the schedule too. So, we'll see what they come out on the other side of these next 3 games with. Hopefully we'll be talking to you, either next Tuesday or Wednesday. So it might be on the heels of that Blues game, but that's 4 games between now and then. We'll see what the Sabres come out on the other side of, and hopefully we're talking to you next week on the heels of a few nice wins. So, see what the Sabres give to us, and we'll be back to talk to you after that.
So long.